Okay, greetings, people. So, how you doing? Welcome back to Sophiology Central. I apologize again for being absent for so long. It's been crazy days here on my farm for various reasons. But today, I wanted to talk about, like, just recently wrote a couple Substacks entitled "Surely Some Revelation Is at Hand." And if you know your literary history, you know that's a quote from William Butler Yeats' poem "The Second Coming." And this is kind of ultimately it's kind of about the second coming, but not in the way you might expect. Now, as I've done shows before on the Otherworld and things like this, it's certainly a topic I come back to again and again. And recently, I was actually on the Regeneration podcast. Mike and I were talking about what's coming, and I had just come off of editing a couple books that were kind of about religion or mysticism and quantum physics, quantum mechanics. Or at least they brought up some of the issues, which, quantum mechanics is something I've been interested in for a long time. I think in 2000 or so it's 25 years ago, when I was in graduate school at the University of Detroit Mercy in Detroit, Michigan. I was working on a project. I think I was taking a course, directed study on the imagination. And I don't know how, but I bumped into, it's over here. I'm going to talk about it later. The Undivided Universe, which is a book by quantum physicist David Bohm, who was actually a student of Albert Einstein, amongst other things, and his friend Basil Hiley. And I think it was just published in '93. So when I was in graduate school, it was relatively new book, just a few years old. Because actually, it was probably before 2000. It was probably closer to, because I got my degree in 2000. So it was probably 98 when I read this book. So anyway, so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about, in quantum mechanics, this idea of multiverses that comes up, or non-locality, multiple bodies, all kinds of really crazy stuff. You would think, at least heretofore, would have been considered crazy. But it brought me back to one of my very favorite books ever, which I know I've talked about before, W.I. Evans Wentz's The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. And he wrote this as his doctoral dissertation at Oxford, which it was published in 1911. So, I don't think Oxford's doing stuff like that anymore, just between you and me. But part of his research, he just went out, and this is kind of in that tradition of the Brothers Grimm, or Cecil Sharp, the guy who collected all the folk songs in Ireland and England and Scotland. He went around and he just talked to peasants who claimed to be able to see fairies, or into the other world, or see the dead, or whatever it happens to be. They had the second sight, as they say, right? So he went out and interviewed people. And it's kind of an anthropology of the other world, which I don't know if anthro is the right suffix there, but you get what I'm saying, right? He was doing it like the anthropologist would go to study, a different culture in, say, Borneo or something, So that's what he did. And so he's talking to this one guy he only describes as an Irish seer. And this Irish seer, and the other seers he talked to, talked about, when we think of the fairy realm, it's not just one species of being out there, we could, like, leprechauns, for instance, or whatever, There's a whole bunch of different populations, and from high to low. And what's interesting with this Irish seer, when he talks about the gentry. Now, I don't think that's what they call themselves. I can't remember the Irish name, but it translates as the good people, and I'm sure they don't call themselves that either. These are all things called that they're called by people, human beings, right? And so he calls them the gentry, and he, and so the Evans Wentz says, well, what are they like? And the guy says, and this is a quote: "The folk are the grandest I've ever seen. They are far superior to us, and that is why they are called the gentry. They are not a working class, but a military aristocratic class, tall and noble appearing. They are a distinct race between our own and that of spirits, as they have told me. Their qualifications are tremendous. We could cut off half the human race, but would not, they said, for we are expecting salvation." We're expecting. So, were they confessing that they're Christians? Something. That's one of my arguments, but it's certainly interesting. And he's not the only one that they said that they told him they were expecting salvation. There was another seer that Evans once talked to. And so this got me to thinking, as things do, connected to quantum physics and non-locality, et cetera, and people who stumble into the fairy realm. I think there are people who can see it, but it's not everybody, right? And usually the people who see it aren't treated so well, and sometimes they come back a little touched, as you know. Now, if you know the story of Tam Lin, which Robert Burns read it into a great poem, but it's a wonderful folk song that, for instance, Fairport Convention did kind of a folk rock version of it back in '71 or so, and more recently, maybe 10 years ago, Anais Mitchell, who after more recently has been famous for Hadestown. She, with I think his name's Jefferson something, I can't remember his last name, did a wonderful version you can find on YouTube of the Tamlin ballad, which they I don't know if it's their melody or it's beautiful. If you want to check it out. But the story with Tamlin is that he was a knight who fell off his horse while hunting and then was captured by the Queen of Faeries, who does not want to give him up. And then he meets this girl, Janet, who helps him escape. Look at that. I'm doing this thing with the light. And Janet helps him escape because he knows what they have to do to get him out. And there's lots of stories like this, right? And then there's the American story of Rip Van Winkle, right? When Rip goes into the realm of fairies, stumbles in there, drinks some of their beer, and disappears for, 30 years or something. And there are lots of stories like that where, with the stories of the changelings, right? Changeling, a baby's captured by the fairies because they see him, there's some kind of excellence or intelligence in him or her. And lots of stories about this. And so and part of the takeaway, I think, is that people who stumble into that realm, and I wrote this in my poem, The Bekan, in my book, Mythologies of the Wild of God, that part of them never comes back. You're never fully a part of whatever we want to call this world, post-enlightenment world. You're never completely part of it once you peek into that other realm, even if it's just for a moment, right? It's there. So you're kind of straddling two worlds in a way, even though you're not really fully a citizen of the other world, but you've been there, right? So you've seen what it is, and you can't not see it. So that's kind of an interesting thing, but that made me think of, why don't more people see this? I mean, people do. Pardon me. I think it's Francis. Last name is Young, Simon Young, who puts out on a regular basis. You can find it on academia.edu. That's what it's called. the fairy census, where he just goes around collecting stories from people, who say they saw fairies, remember whether they saw them last week or they saw them when they were a little girl, 30 years ago or whatever it happens to be, right? And he doesn't, I saw an interview with him once, and he doesn't quite know what to make of it, but he does take these people seriously, right? So he doesn't dismiss them as kooks or as somebody who fell and bumped their heads. But so why is it that more people can't see into this realm? Well, I think part of it is that we have an education system in the West, and not just going back to the Enlightenment, probably before, that squelches that talent, if you will, or gift of seeing into the world. So people are taught, no, you didn't see anything. It says your imagination. An imagination, though, I'm a poet, a follower of William Blake. The imagination is a powerful tool. It's an organ of perception. But anyway, I want to read you what Thomas Traherne says in his book Centuries about what happens, right? And Thomas Traherne, if you don't know, was an Anglican priest and probably one of the most beautiful writers in England, certainly of the 17th century, if not of all time. The first light which shined in my infancy in its primitive and innocent clarity was totally eclipsed, insomuch that I was fain to learn all again. If you ask me how it was eclipsed, truly by the customs and manners of men, which like contrary winds blew it out, by an innumerable company of other objects, rude, vulgar, and worthless things, that like so many loads of earth and dung did overwhelm and bury it, by the impetuous torrent of wrong desires in all others whom I saw or knew, that carried me away and alienated me from it, by a whole sea of other matters and concernments that covered and drowned it, finally by the evil influence of a bad education that did not foster and cherish it. And I think he's right on the money there. It's conditioning, right? We're conditioned to think that doesn't exist, to think that fairies don't exist, to think that angels don't exist, to think that God doesn't exist, right? We are immersed in that atmosphere. But, of course, we know, as Simon Young points out, a lot of people are kind of resistant to that, myself included. Because once you see there, and once you talk to people who've been there, you at least have to think, well, as in Shakespeare, maybe there are more things both in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. All right, so that's, pardon me, that's really important, I think, to think about this. But it's not just a matter of folklore and people with poetic sensibilities, people who are, what do they call it, right brain, right? Who are more intuitive and imaginative. And certainly you're going to see a lot more of that peeking into that world of people who have richer and less compromised imaginations than you will necessarily in a scientist, but it exists in scientists too. And David Bohm's one of them. So I want to read you something from toward the end of their book, which is a long book. And here's what he says, and it's kind of mind-blowing. This is 1993, it was published. For the human being, all this, meaning quantum theory, implies a thoroughgoing wholeness, in which mental and physical sides participate very closely in each other. Likewise, intellect, emotion, and the whole state of the body are in a similar flux of fundamental participation. Thus, there is no real division between mind and matter, psyche and soma. The common term psychosomatic is in this way seen to be misleading, as it suggests the Cartesian notion of two distinct substances in some kind of interaction. And I have to say, what he calls this is implicate order, meaning that the whole is implied in the part, and the part is implied in the whole. Meaning, it's very similar to the ancient natural science or natural philosophy ideas concerning the microcosm and the macrocosm. But for him, goes down even to quantum states. And they continue. Extending this view, we see that each human being similarly participates in an inseparable way in society and in the planet as a whole. What may be suggested further is that such participation goes on to a greater collective mind, and perhaps ultimately to some yet more comprehensive mind in principle capable of going indefinitely beyond even the human species as a whole. So that's God to you and me, right? And I think he's right, for one thing. And I think, if you know the Heisenberg principle, where particles or matter behaves differently while being observed. Now, we all have this experience of how our observation or our participation affects what we're looking at. And also, it's kind of a weird thing, our relaxation of our intention. So you've had this experience that you're kind of pursuing a goal. You want to find an answer to a perplexity, or even find a job or something like that, right? You really you're focusing all your attention to it. You're just thinking, right? You can't, but then nothing happens. You don't get the answer to the question. Don't get a job. Don't get any calls. Don't get an interview. Nothing. But then, and we've all had this happen, once you relax that intention, answer comes to you. Or, you get a call out of the blue. Hey, you want this job? And this happens. We see that we've all experienced this. And there was actually a book, and I can't remember the guy's name, but it was called The Paradox of Intention. Which I think certainly touches on the idea of quantum theory and quantum mechanics and the participation of consciousness in the world around us, and actually not just the world around us, the invisible worlds around us. And one of the things Bohm and Hiley call it is enfoldment, that these different maybe universes or states of consciousness or other things are enfolded in in the world around us. So we don't see everything. There are things enfolded in there, and I would say you could say the other world or the other worlds. I think there's probably a lot of them. That the other world is enfolded in there, and then according to a state of consciousness, I mean, we might call that state of consciousness contemplation, or I like presence is a better word, because contemplation might sound like you're thinking. But being present allows it to appear to us. Now, I think I've used this example before, but it's happened to me so many times, it's inescapable. Hunting. So in hunting, for instance, this happens all the time. So you're hunting for deer. So your mind is on deer, right? And whether you're sitting in a deer blind or walking through the field, guess what? You don't see any deer. What do you see? Rabbits and squirrels. It's like a law of the universe. Similarly, say you're hunting for rabbits or squirrels. Do you see any rabbits and squirrels? No. What do you see? You see deer. So this thing goes. It's happened so many times that I can't deny it. Or turkeys. You see turkeys too. So it's undeniable that this goes on. We've all experienced it. So what happens, the people who become successful in hunting, I think this is probably what Native Americans know, is that the way to make it happen is to not try to make it happen. To just be present, and not, because I think what happens when your intention is connected to your will, and it's like you're sticking your will out there in the forest, and the animals go, not going over there. And as I mentioned before, and I think this is also true, I think, especially in the terms of large game like deer, you don't kill a deer. It gives itself to you. This is what the Native Americans think, and I'm with them on that. Now, so I think this is all pretty interesting, but here's the question, right? You start looking at all this stuff, and you're like, well, what do we actually know? I don't think we know anything. I think what the things that we think we know are such a small, tiny pinprick, so infinitesimally small, and we think we know everything, you know, through our hubris. Now, case in point. So recently, and I don't know where this is going or how they're going to do this, but you probably heard that scientists have found underneath the pyramids at Giza enormous structures with gigantic columns. And I don't know how they're going to get down there, but it's pretty extraordinary what they found. But, the point being, for how many centuries people assumed that the pyramids were tombs. And it doesn't look like that at all. Some people are suspecting that they were maybe power stations or something. I don't know what they were. I don't think anybody does. But the thing is, we didn't have any clue what was really going on. We didn't. In fact, it's classic tip of the iceberg kind of thing. We were just looking at the tip of the iceberg and thought we were seeing the whole in the case of the pyramids. And I think that analogy applies to the world writ large. We know so little about it. And I think quantum mechanics is starting to get someplace. And consciousness studies is starting to get someplace. But it's still, I don't know if they'll ever be able to unpack it very much. But I think it's fascinating that how the world responds to our consciousness and to our state of awareness and our state of being. It's just, I think it's, we have proof all over the place. Now, so here's an example. I don't think well-meaning poets and scientists are the only ones who know about this. I think, and this is going to get conspiracy theory sounding, I think there are some bad actors in the world who also know how consciousness works, and that it can be manipulated. And in fact, they always try to manipulate it. So we've all had the experience too. And I think, though I think less recently, but I still have the experience. But a couple of years ago, we were all having this experience with our cell phones. Like we'd be thinking about pizza, for instance. Open up your phone, first app you get to, you get an ad for pizza, right? And people are like, my phone's reading my mind. What is, and they're not telling us. But I think somebody knows how it works and is trying to capitalize on it in it, speaking, and that's in terms of capitalism. But I think, you have to take it the next step. If it's not, I don't think it's just about selling products. It's got to be some other stuff as well, right? So I think this is I think we're at a particularly interesting watershed moment in human history as far as consciousness and what the things we know about. Now, I want to say this, and yes, it's ironic, but even the internet, right, is a kind of an other world. But I wouldn't call it quite demonic, but it can be demonic. There are demonic elements to this underworld, or this other world. And you see it also with AI, that it's a demonic fairy realm. Well, I just saw this morning that I think China has an AI that's can make movies now that don't really seem believable now, but they will be relatively quickly. Or music. I was just talking to a music producer, and he's talking about, why get a bass player if you can just program something and say, give me a bass part that sounds like James Jamerson, So it's kind of it's an other world, but it's a mechanical other world, and it's synthetic other world, and I don't want to have parts. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Nevertheless, we are still at this Horizon event, and I'm going to read you the conclusion of my second essay that on my Substack on surely there is some revelation at hand. And I say, on the other hand, just as our cell phones reading our minds, unscrupulous actors or entities also know about the nature of reality and consciousness, and like the demons of legend, seek to rig the game to their own benefit in the hopes of preventing the disclosure of reality to all but a few. This is certainly the case with the burgeoning transhumanist agenda, which promises a synthetic kairos and a machine-based consciousness. Just as certain aspects of the internet can be accounted synthetic parodies of the otherworld, transhumanism offers an AI-augmented salvation, a demonic parody of the coming of the New Jerusalem. And this is by design of those the Gnostic scriptures call the archons, the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens, of Ephesians 6. The best way to prevent this acquisition of something good is to offer a cheap substitute as an alternative. We find ourselves at a watershed moment, one at which the imagination can either lead to liberation or slavery. But the default feature of the imagination is liberty. And I end with a quote from Thomas Traherne. Few will believe the soul to be infinite, yet infinite is the first thing which is naturally known. Bounds and limits are discerned only in a secondary manner. And with that, I will say, if you liked what I had to say, hit the like button, subscribe, but also I love to hear comments, and I often respond, almost always respond, or at least hit the like button on your comment if I don't have anything to add to it. But if I have something to add to it, I will share. All right, so until next time, go out and do good things. Take care.